Today we are going to look at a plot diagram, which is the most basic structure of a story. There are 5 components within a plot diagram: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Now there are more components that can be included to get more detailed, but for right now we're just going to focus on the basic 5. This is how the majority of stories are written. It's very familiar to readers, it's very familiar to writers, authors, anyone creating a story. While you can jumble these around, you can go in whatever order you want, it's typically a little bit more confusing for your readers. So while some filmmakers, while some authors will jumble the stories around, they'll start with the resolution and work backwards, or start in the climax and then go back to the beginning. That's not something you really need to worry about right now. We're just going to look at the 5 basic components. And these are really important if you want to improve as a writer or as a reader, because you need to know how to read a story and what to predict. And if you're trying to write, you need to know what's going to be familiar to readers. Now you can challenge your readers like I mentioned earlier, but this is typically the tried and true story. So just so you know, there are 3 other words that might be helpful for you as you're watching this if I reference them. You have your protagonist, who is the main character, typically the good guy, typically the good girl, the person we usually root for. You have the antagonist, the person who goes against the main character, the bad person, the villain. And then you have conflict, which can be your problems between your separate characters. So starting with exposition. This is the introduction to the story, its setting, and its characters. This is where you'll typically meet your protagonist. This is where you'll typically find out where the story is taking place, when the story is taking place, and any other really important background information. From there, we go into the rising action. This is when the characters face that conflict that drives the story. This is where you'll meet the antagonist. You don't usually meet the antagonist right away in the beginning, but often you will. And the rising action, you see what causes the main character's problems or issues. As the rising action builds and builds and builds, we get to the climax of the story. This is the most exciting part of the story. This is where the main action happens. And the climax can be a really short scene, or it can be quite a while. This is where the main action of the story happens, where the antagonist and the protagonist really come together and the issues they've been facing come to a head. After the climax, we go to the falling action. This is what happens as a result from the climax. So after the climax, what happens? It's not the end of the story yet, because there still needs to be things that are resolved. Once we're done with the falling action, we lead to the resolution. The resolution is finally what happens at the end of the story, whether the problem was or wasn't solved. Typically, in most books we read, we usually have positive resolutions where everything works out for the main character, or even if things don't work out, a lesson is learned. But sometimes you really do have a negative resolution. Sometimes it's just a sad or a bad ending. So if we go and look at the plot diagram for the story Cinderella, most of us are pretty familiar with the story. However, if you're not, I'll link the story below so you can read it for yourself and come back and look at this. So, in the very beginning of the story, we meet Cinderella, her stepmother, and her 2 stepsisters. All we know about where the story is set is at their home in some sort of unknown kingdom. Because there's a prince and a princess, there's no princess, because there's a prince and a kingdom and the balls and their dress, we can assume that it takes place in a long time ago, not in our modern day setting, but we're not 100% sure. After we meet our characters, it goes to the rising action. We find out that Cinderella's parents are gone and she lives with her mean stepfamily. They're cruel to her, they make her do chores, they won't let her leave for the ball that every other fair maiden in the village, in the kingdom, is attending. Finally, after a while, her fairy godmother shows up and she helps Cinderella to become beautiful. Cinderella goes to the ball where she has fun. She meets the prince. The climax then, this leads to the climax, where, as I mentioned, it can be a little bit longer. Cinderella meets the prince. They fall in love with each other. She runs away when she realizes it's almost midnight. He finds her shoe and swears to find her. She gets home. Her stepmother realizes she was gone, so now she gets locked in the room. After The prince is looking all over for his lost love. He shows up to Cinderella's home. The stepmother tries to trick him and get her to marry her daughters instead, but he realizes that they're not who he's looking for. He does find Cinderella, and he discovers that she's the woman he was looking for. The resolution is at the very end of the story. They get married and live happily ever after, and Cinderella never has to work again. So in this case, it is a positive resolution. Cinderella finds her prince, they become happy, they live happily ever after. It's how most Disney movie ends. Now, sometimes you want to identify what the major problems in the story are. In this case, it's the relationship between Cinderella and her family. They're cruel to her, they're mean to her, they don't respect her. The second conflict, is finding the woman the shoe belongs to. The prince wants to meet this woman and marry her because he fell in love with her at the ball. So this is a very short and very simple plot diagram for the story of Cinderella. There's even shorter stories like The Boy Who Cried Wolf or Rumpelstiltskin, which you can do this to, or you can do something even longer like The Hunger Games or Harry Potter or The Devil's Arithmetic. Any story that you read, you should be able to apply this chart to. I hope you found this helpful. Good luck.